Elizabeth had always believed that control was synonymous with safety. For years, she built her empire like someone erecting a fortress. Contracts signed ahead of schedule, meetings starting punctually, decisions made without hesitation. She was respected, feared, and admired. The name Elizabeth Hartman was etched into the glass walls of her downtown office, reflecting the sunlight like a promise of permanence. That morning, however, the reflection in the glass seemed distorted. The world had changed without asking permission. The pandemic advanced like an invisible shadow, and week after week, her business began to crumble. Clients canceled contracts. Suppliers vanished. Employees, once confident, now watched her with eyes heavy with fear. Elizabeth kept a firm posture, but inside, everything was trembling. The final blow came in silence, a bank notification informing her that the company's cash flow could no longer sustain even one more month of operation. That night, alone in an apartment that was far too large, Elizabeth sat on the living room floor, her back against the sofa, and cried without making a sound. She wasn't just crying for the money. She was crying for the identity that was dissolving before her eyes. She was no longer the woman in command. She was just someone trying to survive. Days later, after selling her car and officially closing the company, Elizabeth walked aimlessly through the city. That was when she saw the poster in the window of a small agency: rent-to-wife, domestic services, nanny, family support. She laughed. Then, she took a deep breath. And she walked in. The agency owner, a woman with a calm voice named Sophia, listened to Elizabeth's story without judgment. She took notes, observing the slender hands that now trembled slightly. "The job requires humility," she said. "Sometimes, it requires silence. And almost always, it requires heart." Elizabeth agreed, without knowing exactly what she was getting into. The following week, she received her first contract. Client: Leonardo Moreau. Address: wooded neighborhood, north of the city. 2 daughters, Sophia, 8 years old. Helena, 6 years old. When she read the name, something froze inside her. Leo. The memory came like a blade. Years ago, while she still ran her company, Leo had been one of the operations managers. He had questioned one of her decisions during a meeting. Elizabeth, feeling challenged in front of the team, reacted poorly. She humiliated him in public. Without properly investigating an administrative error that wasn't even his, she signed his termination that same week. She never apologized. She never looked back. Now, life had closed a cruel circle. Elizabeth arrived at Leo's house on a cold morning, wearing simple clothes, hair tied back, no makeup. The gate opened, and he appeared at the door. His eyes recognized her immediately. A slow smile formed on his lips. "Elizabeth Hartman," he said in a low voice. "The world really does love irony." She swallowed hard. "Good morning, Mr. Moreau. I am here for the agency contract." He watched her for long seconds. Then he opened the door. "Come in. We have 1 month." 1 month. For him, it was enough time to serve justice. For her, it was all she had left to keep from sinking for good. The daughters ran to her on the first day. Curious, smiling, full of questions. "Are you going to live here? Do you bake cakes? Do you know how to tell stories?" Elizabeth, who had always lived surrounded by numbers and spreadsheets, felt an unexpected warmth in her chest. That night, alone in the guest room, she wrote in her old notebook, "Perhaps losing everything is the only way to learn who we truly are." That same night, Leo, on the other side of the wall, looked at old photos on his phone. Among them was the image of his firing, the cold email, the shame, the void. The past was pulsing. Revenge seemed sweet. But the silence of the house, broken only by the quiet breathing of his daughters, brought another question. How long can hatred sustain someone? And so it began. The most difficult month. The most transformative month. The month none of them would ever forget. Elizabeth woke up every day at 6 in the morning. Not because it was required by the contract, but because the silence of the house at that hour was the only time she could organize her thoughts before putting on the invisible uniform of her new life. An apron, patience, and silence. The smell of fresh coffee spread through the kitchen as she watched the sunrise through the window. Before, this light used to find her inside glass offices. Now, it illuminated pots, scattered toys, and a schedule stuck to the fridge with crooked drawings from the girls. The first few weeks were hard. Leo made sure to remind her, without direct words, of who held control now. He corrected small details, requested tasks outside of what was agreed upon, changed schedules. Everything was done with excessive, cold, and calculated politeness. Elizabeth understood the intent, and she accepted it. Every request, every correction, every silence was the price of her survival. But what she didn't expect was the weight of her own conscience. The nights were long. When she lay down, Leo's face from that old meeting returned to her mind. The tone of her own voice. His embarrassment. The way she had stood up without giving him a chance to explain. Pride, now, seemed like a distant luxury. The girls, on the other hand, transformed the house. Sophia was observant, mature beyond her years. Helena was pure energy, quick to laugh and give unexpected hugs. Within days, they began waiting for Elizabeth at the door when she returned from the market. They brought her drawings and asked for bedtime stories. "Will you stay?" they asked every night. And she stayed. She began to realize something she had never learned in business books. Care creates invisible but indestructible bonds. It was on a rainy afternoon that Clara entered her life. Clara worked as a maid for one of Elizabeth's neighbors but had lost her job when the family moved away suddenly. With nowhere to go, she knocked on the door of Elizabeth's apartment, where she was still living temporarily until her contract with the agency ended. "I just need a few days," Clara said, her eyes tired, a worn backpack hanging from her shoulder. Elizabeth, looking at that young woman without a destination, recognized something painfully familiar. She opened the door. They began to share the small apartment. Two wounded women, trying to rebuild themselves in silence. At night, they sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, talking about life, fears, and mistakes. Elizabeth, gradually, told her about Leo. "He hates me," she would say. "And he's right too." Clara listened in silence. Leo's name began to echo too much in that apartment. At his house, time was also doing its work. Despite his coldness toward Elizabeth, Leo watched in silence as his daughters transformed. Their grades improved, laughter spread through the house, and dinner became a time for conversation again. Elizabeth was patient, attentive, present. One night, Sophia whispered, "Daddy, Elizabeth is like Mommy used to be." The sentence pierced Leo's heart like a blade. He didn't answer. But that night, as he went to bed, the resentment felt heavier than before. Elizabeth felt something different growing inside her. A mix of guilt, hope, and affection. Not for Leo yet, but for that family that, without knowing it, was beginning to heal her. She wrote in her notebook, "Humility hurts. But pride hurts much more when it finally falls." The month progressed, and none of them realized that fate was already preparing the next storm. The day everything began to change was too silent. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard laughter coming from the living room. The girls were sitting on the floor with Leo, putting together an old puzzle that no one had touched in years. The scene was simple, almost mundane, but it carried something rare, lightness. She watched from a distance, leaning against the doorframe, and felt a tightening in her chest. Not of pain, of recognition. That family was relearning how to breathe, and she was a part of it. Later, when the girls went to their room, Leo walked into the kitchen. "They've improved a lot since you arrived," he said, without looking at her. Elizabeth dried her hands slowly on a dish towel. "Children just need to be seen," she replied. He remained silent. It was the first time they had spoken without explicit tension. Meanwhile, in the small apartment, Clara was living through a secret conflict. Leo's name echoed in her thoughts, fueled by Elizabeth's stories, the descriptions of a serious, tired, responsible, lonely man. One day, moved by impulse, she created a profile on a dating app and, by coincidence, found his. She swiped. A match. Clara's heart raced. They started talking. Leo, who for years hadn't allowed himself to feel anything beyond responsibility and exhaustion, found in Clara a sense of lightness, curiosity, and interest. She didn't know about his past. She didn't know his pain. It was easy. And for that exact reason, it was dangerous. Elizabeth noticed the change in Leo. He began arriving home later. He smiled at his phone. He brought flowers home without saying who they were for. The girls whispered excitedly. "Daddy is in love," Helena would say. Elizabeth felt a strange tightness in her chest. "It's not jealousy," she told herself. "It's the fear of losing what we are building." One night, without realizing it, she confessed this to Clara. "This house, it's becoming a home. And I'm afraid that if I leave, it will all fall apart." Clara listened in silence. But she hid her face. The meeting happened at a coffee shop. Clara recognized Leo as soon as he walked in. Her heart raced. He smiled, kind, shy. They talked for hours. They laughed. He talked about his daughters and his routine. She talked about dreams and new beginnings. He felt hope. And hope is a dangerous promise. At the house, Elizabeth was getting the girls ready for bed when Sophia asked, "Elizabeth, do you like Daddy?" Elizabeth stood still for a second. "I like taking care of you," she replied. But the question echoed for a long time that night. A few days later, Elizabeth found messages on Clara's phone. The name, Leo. The world seemed to spin slowly. When Clara arrived home, she found Elizabeth sitting at the table, eyes watering, phone in hand. "How long?" she asked. Clara couldn't lie. The trust that had been born between them collapsed. Elizabeth felt betrayed, not just as a woman, but as someone who had offered shelter, friendship, and protection. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm but broken. Clara tried to explain. She tried to justify. She tried to ask for forgiveness. Elizabeth opened the door, and the friendship died there. Meanwhile, at Leo's house, he was getting the girls ready for bed, unaware that the storm was already upon them all. The past had woken up, and now it was determined to collect every emotional debt left behind. The following days were heavy, like storm clouds. Elizabeth carried out her tasks at Leo's house with the same dedication as always, but something inside her had changed. Laughter came rarely. Her gaze was more distant. The girls noticed. "Are you sad?" Helena asked, holding her hand. Elizabeth smiled, forcing a light tone. "Just tired, my love." But it wasn't just exhaustion. It was loss. The loss of the only friendship she had built amidst the rubble of her old life. Clara, for her part, plunged into deep emotional confusion. She loved Leo, or believed she did, but she carried guilt, anger at herself, and shame for having hurt Elizabeth. And then, she made the worst possible decision. She sought Leo out at his house. It was late afternoon when she arrived. The girls were playing in the yard. Elizabeth was in the kitchen. Clara approached, her face tense. "I need to talk to you," she said to Elizabeth, without looking her in the eye. "We have nothing left to talk about." But Clara didn't give up. She followed her into the kitchen. She began to accuse her, distorting stories, suggesting that Elizabeth was manipulating Leo, taking advantage of the girls, planning something that never existed. The words became weapons. The girls, from the doorway, heard everything. Elizabeth felt the floor disappear. "Get out of my sight," she said, her voice trembling. Clara, seized by desperation, did something no one expected. She grabbed a cup from the table and threw it against the wall, shattering it into pieces. "You destroyed my life," she screamed. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. Elizabeth, in shock, ran out, her heart racing, without looking back. The girls were crying. Leo arrived minutes later. He found Clara alone in the living room, the children frightened, and the house in chaos. Clara, breathless, told her version. She lied, distorted, and cried. She said Elizabeth had threatened her, that she had planned to get close to him to take his money, that she had never been sincere. The poison entered without resistance. Leo believed her. Elizabeth wandered through the city aimlessly. The streets seemed too long, too cold. Every step was an effort not to collapse. She thought about giving up on everything. That night, she wrote only one sentence in her notebook: "I no longer know where my place is." The next day, she received a message from the agency. Her contract was suspended until further notice. She was alone, without a home, without a job, without Clara, without the family she had begun to love. But fate wasn't finished yet. Because sometimes, the truth walks slowly, but it never gets lost. Leo's house became strangely silent after Elizabeth's departure. Breakfast returned to being rushed. Laughter was rare. The girls withdrew into themselves, like someone trying to protect something that is about to vanish. Leo tried to follow the routine. He took his daughters to school, went to work, and answered messages from Clara, who now seemed to occupy every bit of his attention. But there was something that didn't fit. The void. The girls began to act differently. Sophia started observing everything more closely. Helena stopped eating properly. At night, the two whispered in their room, exchanging memories of Elizabeth, of the stories, the dinners, the way she made them feel safe. "Daddy is wrong," Sophia said once. "He didn't listen," Helena replied. And so, they decided to act. On Sophia's phone, there were photos. Photos of Clara in the kitchen, agitated. Photos of the broken glass. Photos of Elizabeth crying as she walked out the door. They had taken them without realizing how important those images were. But now, they knew. They waited for the right moment. It was a Saturday night, when Leo returned from a date with Clara, still confused, still insecure. Sophia held the phone out to him. "Daddy, look." The images said everything. The lie began to crumble. Leo's heart sank. He realized the mistake, the pride, the injustice, and he felt the weight of what he had done. He tried to call Elizabeth. No answer. He sent messages. He apologized. He said he needed to see her. Hours later, the phone vibrated in Elizabeth's pocket as she prepared for a decisive job interview, her last chance not to sink completely. She read the message. And she cried. Then, she made the hardest decision, to go back. Elizabeth entered Leo's house like someone stepping into sacred territory. Nothing seemed the same, and yet, everything was still there. The blue rug in the living room, the smell of orange cake, the drawings stuck to the fridge. But there was something different in the air. A silence heavy with regret. Leo was in the living room. His eyes were red, his face tired, his hands trembling. When he saw her, he stood up slowly. "I was wrong," he said, bluntly. "I was wrong with you, with my daughters, and with myself." Elizabeth remained motionless. "I believed in lies. I was unfair, cruel, and I almost destroyed everything that was real in this house." He took a deep breath. "Forgive me." The words fell heavily on the floor between them. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. Inside her, memories mixed, the humiliation of Leo in the past, what she had done to him, and what he had done to her now. Two wounds. The same lesson. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the pain," she said in a low voice. "But it stops it from destroying us." She opened her eyes. "I forgive you." The girls ran and hugged her. Leo watched in silence, with tears streaming down his face. And in that instant, something invisible began to be rebuilt. In the following days, Clara was confronted. The photos, the truth, the pain she had caused. Leo sent her away. Not with hatred, but with boundaries. Elizabeth returned to work at the house, but now in a different position. No longer out of necessity, but by choice. And gradually, a feeling between her and Leo began to grow. Not as a rushed passion, but as trust, as respect, as home. Months later, during a simple afternoon at the park, Leo held Elizabeth's hand and said, "I don't want to waste any more time." He took a small box from his pocket. "Will you marry me?" Elizabeth cried. And she said yes. Elizabeth and Leo's wedding was not grand. There was no luxurious hall, no imported flowers, no long speeches. There was only what mattered most: presents. The girls threw petals along the improvised path in the garden. A few close friends, neighbors, the open sky, and a silent peace that seemed to have taken a lifetime to arrive. When Leo looked at Elizabeth at the simple altar, he didn't see the cold executive who had once humiliated him. He saw the woman who had learned how to fall, get up, ask for forgiveness, and love again. Elizabeth, in turn, didn't just see the man wounded by the past. She saw someone who had the courage to recognize his mistakes and choose to rebuild. They exchanged short but true vows. "I promise to choose you, even when it's hard. I promise not to run away when fear appears." The girls cheered loudly, as if they were celebrating not just a wedding, but the restoration of a family. Time passed. Leo and Elizabeth decided to combine their experiences and found their own company. She, with her administrative talent. He, with his strategic vision. It wasn't just a business, it was a life project. They worked side by side. They made mistakes. They learned. They grew. And they prospered. Not just financially, but emotionally. The house became a home again, full of laughter, long meals, conversations on the porch, and comfortable silences. Elizabeth sometimes still woke up startled by the echoes of the past. But now there was an arm around her, a heart that beat with hers, reminding her that the fall hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. A year later, on a morning lit by the soft sun, Elizabeth held Leo's hand and smiled. "We're going to be 6. She said, overcome with emotion. Twins. The world seemed to suspend time for a moment. The girls danced through the living room, already planning names, rooms, and stories. And Elizabeth, looking out the window, felt something she had never felt before: wholeness. The birth of the twins changed the house in a way no one could have predicted. The crying of the babies in the middle of the night didn't bring exhaustion, it brought purpose. Leo would get up sleepily, stumbling over his own steps, and Elizabeth would smile from the bed, feeling that every difficult second was worth it. The girls vied for who would hold them first, who would help pick out their clothes, who would tell them stories. Life hadn't become perfect. There were days of fear. There were memories that still hurt. There were bills, decisions, and difficult nights. But now, everything made sense. Elizabeth, one morning, sat alone on the porch while watching her children sleep. The sun slowly touched the leaves of the trees, and the world seemed at peace. She thought about the woman she used to be. The rigid executive. The woman who confused control with love. The person who lost everything only to discover what truly mattered. Leo sat beside her. "What are you thinking about?" She smiled. "That sometimes life needs to break us, to teach us how to be whole." He held her hand, and they stayed there in silence, understanding that they hadn't reached the end of a story, but the beginning of a new way of living. And perhaps, while you were listening to this story, you recognized yourself at some point. Perhaps in Elizabeth, trying to stay strong when everything falls apart. Perhaps in Leo, carrying mistakes that seemed too big to correct. Or perhaps in someone who, like them, just needed a second chance, or the courage to start over. If this story touched your heart, keep that feeling with care. And, if you can, share it with someone who is going through difficult days. Sometimes, a simple story is the hug someone needed to receive. If you want to walk with us through other stories of hope, fall, and reconstruction, subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell us, what did this story awaken in you? You are not alone. And it is never too late to start over.